Warming bracket!
What's going on, everyone? So welcome to my latest video. This is obviously my review for the 2012 film, The Grey. So The Grey came out in January of said year. It turns 10 this year, so obviously it gave me a pretty good excuse to finally sit down and review this film for you guys. Spoiler-free, of course. I hate spoilers, and obviously with this film particularly, I don't want to say anything about the actual plot, because I feel like with this movie in particular, you want to go into it knowing as little as possible. And I'll get into that in terms of my relationship with this movie. So I still remember when this movie came out 10 years ago. I do. Because I remember it came out around the same time as Man on the Ledge and Red Tails. And I wanted to see, obviously, The Grey because of the trailers and everything. And my dad and myself both are Liam Neeson fans, especially at this point in time. Like, this was right after Taken, and, we'd seen him in Batman Begins and, Phantom Menace. And still to this day, my dad is a huge Liam Neeson fan. Like, we go to the movies to see his movies. And obviously, Liam Neeson's movies of the last, I would say, 5-10 years have been mostly PG-13. So that's one of the reasons, but my parents don't watch R-rated films. So with The Grey, obviously it had an R rating, so my dad was like, no, we can't see that. So I was like, oh, fine. So we watched Red Tails, and Red Tails, I'm not a big fan of, and I still remember watching Red Tails and hearing wolves in the background, and I was like, why am I hearing wolves? And I realized that playing next door was The Grey. And I wasn't able to watch this movie until like a year after it came out, but despite that, I had to sneak watch it, and I'll never forget when I snuck watch it. I had in my mind that this movie, I need to go in with tempered expectations, because a year later, you hear a lot of people saying, oh, I didn't like the fact that the trailer, was misleading and that it ended very ambiguously, because the trailer gives it to where you think as an audience member, hey, this is going to be Liam Neeson versus wolves. That's awesome. But it's not it. That's not the movie at all. This is a survival movie that's dealing with three-dimensional characters that are facing wolves. It happens to be. But at the same time, they're facing fear. They're facing that fear of death, religion, coming to terms with all that. And I think that this is a movie that it's a slow burn for sure, but it has a lot on its mind that I think, honestly, a mainstream studio doing this was really something that I personally liked, especially now that I'm older and you see how studio movies are now, where it's like every single movie has to, have a tie-in universe. You want to do a Liam Neeson, Wolf universe? It's like, no, the movie's not interested in that. A movie is first act, second act, third act, and that's it. And that's what this movie is. And I think that it is a rock-solid movie with good filmmaking. I especially like the opening scene and the ending scene. It's almost like a book ending. The ending in particular, I think, works really well. No spoilers, but I think the ambiguous nature of it is fitting given the fact that it's dealing with a lot of philosophical themes, in addition to also talking about death itself. Death can sometimes be ambiguous, in terms of like what to expect the hereafter. So I think that it's only fitting that the ending is as such. Liam Neeson gives one of his best performances. I mean, this is clearly a performance that means a lot to him. And I say this because this was a film that came out a couple years after the death of his wife. And I think that he put all of that grief and everything into this role, and it shows because it's such a raw performance. Definitely one of my favorites of his movies. And honestly, I wish that we got the Liam Neeson of this movie instead of the phoned-in Liam Neeson of, the last 5 to 10 years. It's a shame, really, but he does a good job. And also, this movie is very gritty in terms of the way it's shot. It's shot on film, something you also don't really see studios shoot on, unfortunately, anymore. But the gritty, filmic nature of this movie really works wonders. And I really like how there's a lot of wide-angle shots to showcase the desolate area. But in addition to that, there's a lot of close-up shots to really emphasize the human nature of this movie. And speaking of the humans, as I mentioned earlier, this movie is populated with three-dimensional characters that, honestly, at the beginning of the movie, you're like, these are a bunch of jerk-offs. Like, these characters are really hateable. But through them being scared and that fear and really kind of just really putting their guard down in terms of that tough guy status, you see that they are human. They have emotions. And when they emulate that, you really understand where they're all coming from. And I got to give Carnigan props, honestly, for having all these characters that upon first look, you think that they're hateable, but through slowly developing their characters, you care about them. So that way, when things happen, you genuinely feel for them. And I think that that's something that is really important because, I feel like when you go through life and everything, you'll see people and you might see, someone do this or that, and you might not like what they're doing. But then when you actually get to know them and everything, it's like, oh, okay, I understand what you're going through. You only truly know someone once you actually talk to them and everything, not just in passing. And I think that this movie touches on that, and it's really interesting. At least I personally think so. As I mentioned with the cinematography, it's really beautiful and gritty, but at the same time, also the score by Mark Strattonfield really works well with the imagery. And I think that it's subtle at times, but it really knows when to emulate those emotions to match the acting. This is a very well acted movie. Again, I think Liam Neeson carries it for sure. But again, the filmmaking is by no means slack. And I will say this too. Despite all these positives about this movie, and especially feeling that cold nature of this movie, I do have to say that I do take issues with certain things. For one, I do think that the second act does kind of meander a bit, unfortunately. And this is something that I felt with every single viewing. Like, I feel like the first act and the third act are quite strong. It's that middle area that just kind of feels a bit soggy. The other thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of people talk about realism in movies, and a lot of people are like, oh, well, that's not realistic. And I always get annoyed because it's like, well, you got to take into consideration that the director is creating a world, and you want to look at the realism through that world, not the lens of you as a viewer in this world. You want to look at it in the viewer as someone that is in this world. And I think that with that in mind, the world that Carnagan creates here is something that is very desolate, very isolated, but I feel like these characters are very smart and everything, but there are certain situations that characters do things that just don't really feel as though it would be something that they would do, because we established early on that they wouldn't. And especially Ottaway, the lead character, he does something like, I'm not going to spoil anything, but the scene with the two ledges in particular, where it's like they, have a rope go across the other one and then they climb across it, I feel like that's something that Ottaway wouldn't do. He knows so much that he knows that that has a lot more risk than payoff. And I just feel like that was something that just really kind of takes me out. Not going to spoil anything. There's a couple other instances here and there, but the realism was something that kind of took me out a bit. I know some people talk about the wolves and they say, oh, that's not realistic, but clearly those wolves are not supposed to be realistic in our sense. It's supposed to be symbolic, given the context of the world that Carnagan creates. So that's why the wolves, I don't even look at that as something that's an issue. I will say sometimes the wolves do kind of look not that realistic in terms of the CGI. But I will say mostly that gritty look to the film, that filmic look, does help with making the wolves look realistic. But there are times that it didn't really fully bode well. And I think that might just be the fact that it's 10 years later and sometimes CGI just doesn't really age well. But in this case, it's only some instances here and there. But for the most part, I do think that the wolves look pretty good. Not 100%, but sometimes it looks pretty darn good. But overall, The Grey, I think this is a rock-solid film. There's a reason why I own it on Blu-ray. I quite like it. Liam Neeson does a great job. I really like the survival instance of this movie. Opening and ending scene are great. Filming is amazing. I really like the cinematography of this movie. And I definitely say that, especially for a studio movie, this is definitely worth your time. And The Grey, I personally will be giving a... So yeah, guys, The Grey, did you like it? Did you not? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And did you like the ambiguous ending? I personally love the poem that goes with this movie. Don't want to spoil it because I didn't know the poem going into this movie 10 years ago. So I love the poem, but I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on the poem, obviously the ending, and just overall your thoughts on this movie. Comment section down below in terms of that. And as always, guys, thank you very much for watching. With the subscription, notification bell, and I'll catch you guys later.